This videotape, which is one in a series, is intended for interpreters, students, educators, parents, and members of the deaf and deafblind communities. It is designed to provide the viewer with a better understanding of multiculturalism and diversity within the American deaf and deafblind communities. The presenter on this videotape has generously agreed to share his experiences and perspectives of being deafblind. The experiences expressed by the presenter on this tape are his own. They are not necessarily representative of the experiences of other members of the deafblind community. The presenter's experiences are highly personal and are to be respected. They are not meant to denigrate or insult people with different experiences. The presenter's willingness to participate in this videotape series is greatly appreciated. We hope the viewer will watch this videotape with an open mind and will respect the presenter's individual experiences and perspectives.
Let me introduce myself. My name is Mark Landreneau, and I'm from Cajun country in Louisiana. I don't use the derogatory sign for Louisiana. I use the polite LA sign for Louisiana. I was born deaf, and I have Usher syndrome. This is a combination of deafness and a loss of visual field over time. I also have night blindness, and it's difficult for me to see in dimly lit areas. As well, I have a balance problem, and those are the symptoms that go along with Usher syndrome. Let me tell you a bit about my family. There are 5 boys in the family, and I'm the baby. My parents can both hear, and my father would write notes to me in order to talk with me. He didn't know any sign language. But my mother did know how to fingerspell a bit, and she made up some signs that we used around the home. Like she would pat herself or rub herself on the stomach to signify, the food was really good. Or she would gesture she was laying her head on a pillow to go to bed. So we made up those signs to use at home. Now, of the 5 boys, the oldest boy is an eye doctor. And the brother that is the closest in years to me also has Usher syndrome. He's 8 years older than me. Now, the brother who became an eye doctor didn't become an eye doctor because we had a vision loss. He just ironically and coincidentally got into that field. The next older brother is retired Army, and he had a tremendous influence on me. He showed me how to drive a motorcycle, how to scuba dive, and instead of discouraging me from doing things because of my vision, he got me into things and gave me a lot of encouragement. The middle brother is probably the most able to sign, even though he's signing English most of the time, but I was closest to he and the brother with Usher syndrome as I grew up because of the communication issue. So that's the makeup of my family. I did go to the state residential school, and my mother found out about this school from reading an article in the newspaper. And she also recalled an uncle's wife's sister who was older who also had gone to this school. So that's how they decided to send my brother and I to the residential school. I was very fortunate that she made that decision. I entered school when I was 6, and I already had a strong language base because I signed and communicated with my brother for 6 years before I started school. And many of my classmates had parents who were deaf and had siblings who were also deaf. So we were very adept with our language, even in the very first grade. And I enjoyed school. I remember playing and having such a good time with the kids. Even in the dark outside at night, we would play hide and seek. And I remember still being able to participate and having a good time. I could see just fine. But later, I started to notice things. One example is when we were in the dorm in the evening, all the kids in their beds, we would start to play and get into stuff, and we had our stuffed animals that we played with, and mine was a little goat, little pink goat. And we would throw our stuffed animals at each other, back and forth all over the room. And I could do this initially, but at some point I started not being able to find where that little goat disappeared to. And I would look and look, but I just, in the dark couldn't find him. And it would sometimes be the next morning that, with the lights turned on, that I could find this little thing. But the rest of the kids were able to play and throw their stuffed animals around. They could even communicate in sign language, which I wasn't able to do in the dark. So that was one thing that started to come to mind about something was going on with my eyes. Another thing had to do with football. I loved football, and I was really good at it, rough and tough. We didn't play the regular football game with two teams. We played with one person punting, kicked the ball, and the rest of us would try to get the ball, and whoever actually caught it would then try to make a beeline to the end zone, and we would all try to tackle that person. Well, we would move up and down the field that way, 40-yard, 50-yard, whatever, moving back and forth. And, of course, the goal was to make a touchdown. And I can remember that I was able to see the football coming, and I could catch it. I could run down the field. But then as time went by, I wouldn't be able to see where the football was going. And sometimes it would go to somebody. I would see who caught it. I'd go running to tackle them, but I would run into somebody. And the kids would start to tease me then, saying, "What are you, blind?" Or they would call me hoarse, like I had blinders on. And I started to realize that something was different about me. Now, this was when I was about 10 years old. And I started basically withdrawing from activities like that and stayed in the dorm room where it was well lit. And I would study. I would talk with my friends, but it just felt safer there because I could see better. And funny about me studying, I would enjoy studying, and then we would have lights out. Well, I would get up and I'd turn the light on because I wanted to study and read books more. And I'd get punished for it. Can you believe it? They would punish me for studying late into the evening. But I recall going to class, and I would be trying to watch the teacher sign, and if somebody else started signing, because of the way that turn-taking happened so rapidly, I couldn't locate the next person who was signing. So I ended up sitting on the end. So if it was a semicircle or rows, I would sit on one end so that I could scan and see who was signing. And this just happened naturally. No one taught me or said anything about it. I just did it as an accommodation for myself. Also, when the teacher was writing on the board, it would be very difficult for me to see, and I would move up closer to copy the work on the board. And the same thing happened if the information was coming on a projector. I'd have to go up close, and I was always the last person to finish my work. And again, I was thinking, boy, there is something going on here, but I didn't know what it was. Now, I found out later that the Louisiana School for the Deaf had many students with Usher syndrome, but I didn't know that at the time. But funny, when we would have our football games, at homecoming time, we'd have other state football teams coming in like Mississippi and Texas, and the kids would sign in a really large space, and the students from the Louisiana school would sign in a smaller visual field, and I think it was because so many of us had Usher syndrome. We just adopted naturally to that. Again, nobody told us or instructed us, but that's just what happened and how we accommodated for our visual loss. While I was still there at the State School for the Deaf in Louisiana, a counselor came and let me know I needed to go have my eyes tested. Now, I thought this was normal and everybody was doing this. But we were actually going to a special place in New Orleans to have our eyes tested, myself and another boy who had Usher syndrome, later I found out. The counselor that was taking us couldn't communicate in sign language, only a bit of finger spelling, but that didn't matter to me because we still got out of school for the day and got to have some food that was different than an institutional food that we were getting every day. So we took our trip and went off to the doctor's appointment where they did a series of tests to check the retina, did an electroretinogram, something that had wires and contact points they were putting around my face. I didn't understand what they were doing, and back in the 70s we didn't have interpreters for things like that. So we just went through the thing, and I thought it was typical. Everybody was having this tested done. But of course, the reason they were doing this was because they were testing for Usher syndrome. I remember going 2 or 3 times, not really knowing why, but just in the back of my mind, remembering this. And also at the same time, I started realizing that I really wasn't very happy with the education I was getting at the school in Louisiana. The teachers signing, it was mostly fingerspelling. A lot of the deaf teachers were resigning and moving away, and something just didn't feel quite right, and I wasn't totally satisfied. I had heard about the school in Florida, the state school for the deaf in Florida, and I started thinking about that. Now, mind you, I was just 12 years old, or around 11 or 12 at the time, and my brother, oldest brother, who was the eye doctor, lived in Florida, and through friends, I kept hearing about Florida and how good a school it was. So I took it upon myself to look up some information. And in the principal's office, there was some books there, the annals of the deaf, and there was some information in there about the Florida School for the Deaf. And the student body was very large, double what we had, about 600 people, and many teachers who were deaf. So I was trying to figure out how I could manage to get myself over to Florida to go to the school there. Of course, my parents were pretty resistant to it. They wanted to keep me home, of course, because I was still young. But they did consent, and I made the move to Florida. Well, that was the best thing I did. The beaches there were exceptional. I loved going to the beach, and I also enjoyed biking. It was easy to do outside activities, and it was a small town. I jogged. I really enjoyed the time there. And it just so happened that at Florida, there was a counselor there working at the school who also had Usher syndrome. And he talked to me about it. And he explained all these things. Now, he didn't actually give me the word Usher syndrome because at that time, the research was still being done. But what he did say was that my vision loss was due to RP, retinitis pigmentosa. We called it RP for short. And he explained to me that people who could hear also had RP, and that deaf people sometimes got RP, and that there were different categories of this Usher syndrome that the researchers were still looking at. So after I got this information, I just went back and looked at all the things that had happened, the kind of unusual things with my eyes, not being able to locate that little goat, the football games, having a hard time struggling in the evening, in the dark. I remember all these things that happened to me, and nobody, teachers, counselors, even my parents, never mentioned a word about what was going on with my eyes until this counselor at the Florida school talked to me about it. So finally, I felt more comfortable, and when things came up, I could talk to him, and my teachers knew I had this condition, so things went pretty well. When I graduated, I got honors. I was second in the class and was salutatorian. Of course, I think back about that time when I got caught studying late at night, when I had the light on and they made me turn the lights out, and I got punished for doing that. Well, it paid off in the end. They shouldn't have punished me. Here I got this honor. Remember me talking about the education I was getting at the Louisiana school and that I felt it wasn't reaching the par of what I wanted? Well, later on, I found out that the teachers and the counselors were told that they had to use visible English, a form of fingerspelling, and that sign language was absolutely forbidden, and they would get in trouble, punished, if they used it. And this was even in their contract that they had to sign. And this policy was made by upper management, but they had to follow it. So then it made sense why the communication issues were happening at that time. I graduated from Florida, and I went to Gallaudet University I really wasn't making use of any accommodations yet. But I remember that Gallaudet had a special department called the Student Special Service Department, and they offered interpreters for deafblind people and specialized equipment and Braille. They had a piece of equipment called a closed-circuit TV that could enlarge print for your books. And I really didn't think I needed this kind of thing. Even though I knew it was available, I didn't take advantage of it. And really, when I look back on it, I wish I had, so that I would have had more energy and been able to keep up with things. But I didn't take advantage of it. At a later point, I met a friend who also had Usher syndrome, who had taken advantage years later when that department changed to the Gallaudet Interpreting Service. And they got an interpreter for their class. Now, the friend tells this story, loved having an interpreter in class for himself. Pretty smart. What he did was he had the interpreter sit in front of him closely, and because the teacher was using a combination of talking, using his voice, and also signing, which was difficult to understand one or the other, he could just look at his interpreter and understand everything that was going on. Well, what happened was the entire student group in that auditorium ended up watching his interpreter instead of looking at the teacher. And the teacher wasn't quite happy with this. In fact, he even said several times to pay attention, look at me, ooh, I'm over here. But most of the students just ended up watching the interpreter because the communication was so much more clear. While I was at Gallaudet, I also met Art Rohrig, who was a terrific role model for deafblind people. He worked at Gallaudet and was terrific support. While I was at Gallaudet, I was still driving, still had my car, and later on Art told me stories about his driving experiences. But I used my car to make the drive from Louisiana to Gallaudet, and then I would leave my car parked at Gallaudet and use the bus, or ride the bike, take the subway to get around locally. But I'd still use my car, on holidays to go home to Louisiana and travel about. I would drive my car while I was in Louisiana to get to people's houses and catch up with folks, because we didn't have any kind of transit system there, so I basically had to use my car, and I remember enjoying it. And at the same time, thinking about, should I still be driving or not? Because I had conversations with Art, who talked about his feelings when he stopped driving and how difficult that was. And I was thinking about, at some point, I would probably have to do that as well. And one time when I was in Louisiana, I remember it was at Christmas time, or I was going to a New Year's Eve party, and a deaf club had put this on, and I was driving there to the party. I had a friend with me who was fully blind, deafblind person, and we were driving to this deaf club out in the country. It was also at night, and of course it was hard for me to see. I noticed that the speed limit was 45 miles an hour, so I slowed down. But of course, a cop was right behind me with his lights flashing, and so I pulled off. I was sitting in the car thinking, oh boy, they're probably very, very strict tonight because it's New Year's Eve, right? And they're watching for drunk drivers. So I communicate tactily with my friend that, yes, indeed, a cop is behind me. I turn the light on and I write a note that I am planning to give to the cop. I don't want to put it in my pocket to whip out because I don't want the cop to misunderstand and thinking I'm pulling a gun. So I just write the note and have it ready and explain that I was in the process of slowing down to 45 miles per hour. And just see what his reaction was, hoping that, he would understand or would excuse me, and I felt sure that that's why it was the speed limit sign. Well, I waited for the cop, but they never did come to my door. But in my rearview mirror, I saw the lights flashing and realized he wanted me to come out and go to his car. So, I'm just panicked thinking I have to get out and walk in the dark with the lights in my eyes. And as well, to make matters worse, I had pulled off and I was on the shoulder of the road with a slight incline, so with my balance, trying to negotiate the incline, maintain my balance in light of these bright glare of the cop's car. I'm trying to, not look like I'm drunk, which a lot of Usher's people do when they're walking because of the balance problems. I just tried to make a straight line to his car. Well, he looked at me, and I brought my note to him, and he turned his flashlight on, read the note, asked me for my license, which I gave him, and then he motioned to me to, slow it down. Didn't give me a ticket. So I motioned back that, yes, indeed, I would slow it down, and I thought, boy, I have made it. And I started walking back, trying to keep in a straight line. I don't know if I did or not, but I finally got in the car and told my friend that I didn't get a ticket. We were both relieved and went off to the party. We still went to that party. We didn't go home. We didn't let it ruin our night, but I was very careful, and certainly very careful coming back home, not to go over the speed limit. But I just remember these stories of how difficult it was to drive. I wanted to drive, but feeling bad about driving and trying to figure this whole thing out. Every year, Gallaudet would have this big event that they called a rock festival. And everybody would come, and I was curious to see what was going on, so I went. And in the crowd, I noticed that there was a person signing tactily that I hadn't met before. So I approached him and found out that he had Usher syndrome, just like me, and also realized that he was visiting from New York, not a Gallaudet student. And he was talking about Seattle being such a terrific deafblind community. Well, I really didn't know anything about Seattle, but I was going to be graduating soon and thinking about where I was going to end up living. I was 1 year off from graduation, so I thought, I wonder if I might move to Seattle or not. But Patrick said that he would come to my graduation next year to make sure that indeed I did make that move to Seattle. Well, when I did graduate, sure enough, he showed up for my graduation and was asking me if I was planning to go visit. Well, in the fall, I did go visit, and boy, did I fall in love with it 100%, and I made the move. I drove out there. My brother helped me, and we took turns driving. We got to Seattle, and there were so many things that Seattle has to offer. The interpreting services are remarkable. The teachers in the ITP programs teach interpreters how to sign in a smaller space, how to make accommodations for the vision, how to tactily interpret, and how not to be afraid of interacting with deafblind people. There are other services as well, like the SSP program, support service providers, who can be matched up with a deafblind person to help them read their mail or to do daily errands, maybe 1-2 hours that they would spend with the person, and basically be their eyes and ears for the deafblind person. The SSP's role is not to make decisions or to take over. Again, it's visual information to give to the deafblind person, and then they make their own decision. An example of this would be going into a grocery store and giving the names of the variety of meats or whatever the deafblind person was interested in, not picking out things for them, but letting them know this has low fat or this is on sale. And this is one of the only programs of its kind in the nation, and it really is quite a remarkable program that many deafblind people take advantage of. As well, Seattle has a good transportation system and employment opportunities, plus the deafblind community being able to socialize with your peers. And many of the deafblind people are not originally, they're not native Seattle folks. They've moved there from many states. And, I felt like I found my place from many years of trying to figure out what was going on with my vision, what was it that made me feel different. Once I got to Seattle, I felt like I had found my home. I ended up working as an independent living teacher when I first got to Seattle, and as I interacted with deafblind people, certainly shared different stories. And one of them that we share with each other is rather funny. It's about how to be able to wake yourself up in the morning, have an alarm clock, when we didn't have the kind of high-tech things that we have now with vibrating pagers and light signalers, because nothing was available at the time this person was telling me this story. And what this person would do, they would fill up a glass with water and they would drink it before they went to bed. And then, when they had to get up to go to the bathroom, well, it functioned as their alarm clock. Just a simple solution to something that many of us hadn't thought about. So it was just these kinds of things that we shared with each other that really made a difference. Another one had to do with a deaf-blind person who was going shopping for a blouse. Her name was Colleen Cook, and such a role model for people. She went into the clothing store, and at this time we didn't have the SSP program, so she went on her own and found a blouse that she liked, but couldn't quite make out the size, couldn't read the tag, and wanted to take it over to a salesperson. So she wrote a note and walked over to the salesperson and showed her the note, asking for the size. Well, she got no response from this person at all. It looked like they were just completely ignoring her. So Colleen tried again, and again, nothing, not a muscle movement. Colleen got closer and accidentally bumped the arm, and this person fell right over backward. Well, it ended up being a mannequin. With Colleen's eyes, she couldn't quite make out the person and didn't realize it wasn't a live person that she was talking to, but a mannequin. Well, that SSP program has solved that problem. But, these kinds of stories, our folklore, are the kinds of ways that we share with each other how to resolve some things. There's another story about a deaf-blind couple who owned their own home. They were both fully blind, but independent to the hilt. I mean, they had their own home, and they wanted to take care of the yard themselves. And the way they did this, imagine being fully blind and mowing your yard. Well, they put a metal stake in the center of their yard. It was a square-shaped yard. Put a metal stake in the center and wrapped a rope around it on one end and a rope to the lawnmower on the other end. And as they mowed the lawn, the rope would wrap around the metal stake and they'd circle in and get the lawn mowed that way. Of course, the four corners didn't end up getting mowed that way. So what they did there was just planted some bushes, plants, and flowers there and took care of it. By talking with deaf-blind people who share the same experiences, you really come up with ways to do things rather than talking with other folks who don't have that common experience. And because of having a community of support, I felt my identity as a deaf-blind person came into being there. But interesting, when I meet a deaf person, I tell them that I have tunnel vision, so that we make the connection there that we're both deaf. We both have a shared language, culture, going to the state school for the deaf. And when I meet a person who can hear, like the general public, I tell them that I am deaf-blind, so that they understand that there are two issues going on at the same time. And I just naturally identify myself in different ways depending on who I'm with. As I got more and more involved with the deaf-blind community, I was more and more interested in sharing that information and providing trainings and workshops for other people. So I gave presentations, and I would use an interpreter with me when I would present about deaf-blind communication, tactile signing, and so forth. Well, during one of the earlier presentations, I noticed that the students were not very responsive to what I was saying, and I wasn't really sure what that was about, but I didn't think too much of it. The presentation was videotaped, and at a later date, I decided to have an interpreter come in and sign for me what the voice interpreter had been saying to get an idea of what I sounded like to the students. Well, it wasn't at all what I was saying. The vocabulary choices weren't what I was saying. For example, TB in the deaf-blind community refers to a piece of equipment that you use with the phone called a telebraille. And of course, in our field, we have different abbreviations and things that we use to signify communicating with deafblind people, visual information, tactile signing. Well, none of this information was conveyed, and I learned from that point to bring an interpreter in who had experience and who had been socializing with deafblind people so that they would have the background to be able to work with me as a team while I'm giving the presentations. I felt more and more confident, more and more competent, and yearning for more. And I was thinking about deafblind people in other parts of the world. And it just so happened that there was a chess tournament for deafblind people in Denmark. And I got this advertisement, and they were inviting 20 deafblind people to come to Denmark. People from Russia, all over the world, could apply to go. Well, I didn't want to actually participate in the chess tournament. I just wanted to go and meet other Usher's people from around the world. So I made my flight arrangements for Denmark, planned to stay there for a week during the tournament. But the tournament folks contacted me by email and said that one person from England had to withdraw, and they asked me if I wanted to play. Well, I wasn't too up on that because I didn't know all of the rules, very formalized rules that they were going to be using, but I decided to go ahead and practice, learn as much as I could from friends, and go ahead and do it. So 3 Americans went to this chess tournament. We had 3 volunteers with us. Very interesting process, and so intriguing that as soon as I got there, even though our sign languages were different, I immediately felt a connection. They signed in a smaller space, so it was within my field of vision. They had the lights the way I needed them, you know, halfway across the country, and here we are, immediately bonded. It was an exciting time. The chess tournament had people there who were fully blind and some who could see, and the way they set it up was that the deafblind people would sit across from each other, each having their own volunteers, and each deafblind person would have their own chessboard. So when I would make my move on my chessboard, the volunteer for the other person would make that identical move on that person's chessboard so that they could tactily or visually be looking at their board and deciding their next move or studying without interrupting what I was doing. We also had timers to make sure that we had a limited amount of time to make our move. And those Europeans were quite talented with chess. I think they played chess every day. Unlike me, I'm out camping or riding my bicycle. I'm not paying attention to learning the chess moves. Now, they used the sign, the V hand shape for chess, and they were really into it. The way they had it set up was with 10 tables in 2 rows, and each table had a lamp, an overhead lamp, and of course the cord was taped down so the deafblind people wouldn't fall over it or trip. They thought of everything because they also had Usher syndrome themselves, deafblind people. They thought of everything. They really understood what our needs were and made the accommodations for it. We had volunteers there. People there knew how to sign in a small space, keep it within our field of vision. Very enjoyable experience. Now, of course, I didn't win. I came in 16th. Not too bad. The other Americans were a little bit lower on the scale than me, and one even actually came in last place. But they got the good sportsmanlike award, because every time they lost a game, they would shake hands with the person, have a big smile on their face, so they got an award. They actually did better than me, I guess. I had a friend who lived in Switzerland who had Usher syndrome, and the way they sign Switzerland, the sign for the country, is right in front of your face so that deafblind people can see it, instead of the formal sign for it is against your body. Well, before I made this trip to Switzerland, I had surgery on my eyes to remove the cataracts, because what I was seeing was rather like a window that's just filthy with so much dirt that you could hardly see through it. But once the surgery took place and they put the implants in, the lens implants, I could see crystal clear. It was amazing. And of course it was perfect timing since I was taking this trip to Switzerland. I could see the Alps. I could see everything. And, you know, it gave me memories of that trip that I wouldn't have had if I hadn't had that cataract surgery beforehand. We spent a month there on my honeymoon, and I met some other deafblind people there. And my good friend who has Usher syndrome, his name is Beat, B-E-A-T, took us around the country. But one time my wife and I decided that we would just go on this little excursion ourselves into town. So I had my cane with me, and we got to the corner, and I just stopped waiting for the cars to go by and just set my cane down, and it disappeared. Well, I looked down, and there was a grating with water, and my cane had gone right in between the grates. Well, I was nervous because I had borrowed this cane from Pierre, and I pulled the grating off. All eyes are upon me, you know, people that are standing around on the street. And culturally, they tend to be a bit more serious, have a bit more serious demeanor than us Americans. Well, I'm trying to get my cane out of there. It's just floating in this sewer water. And I pick the little tip up and pull it out. Well, it's just absolutely filthy. But luckily, one woman comes over to me with a little handkerchief, Kleenex, something like that, and I wiped it off, and everybody was laughing by that point. But that's one of my funny stories from Switzerland, using this cane and having it disappear. We had a great time there. You know, when I think back on my years and my life experiences, I certainly had some trying times. Frustrations with not knowing what was really going on with my vision. But overall, I look at the community, finding that community in Seattle, deafblind people, and the support that I've had for my friends, interpreters who become friends, deaf people who know what's going on with people who are deafblind, and deafblind people themselves. It's been such a rich experience. And I hope that the kinds of things I've learned will be passed on to people for future generations of deafblind people, so that you'll be aware, you'll have the knowledge, you'll have that information, you'll have that access right at hand. I don't want to go back to the kinds of situations that I had to incur. The deafblind community makes such a difference and provides such support. I really care about this community and our deafblind culture.